"He hasn't eaten since Tuesday," the boy said, and Garrett Olson stood very still in the gravel lot and listened to the sound of that sentence settle into him like a stone dropping through cold water. It was Thursday morning. The boy was 7 years old, maybe 8, and he was sitting on a concrete parking barrier outside the Dollar General on Sturgis Road with a plastic grocery bag knotted twice around his wrist, not holding it, not swinging it, just wearing it, the way you wear something you are afraid will disappear if you set it down. His sneakers were gray where they had once been white. His jeans had a tear at the left knee sealed with electrical tape. He had not moved from that barrier in 40 minutes, which Garrett knew because he had ridden past on his way to the fuel stop and seen him there, and now he had ridden back and the boy had not shifted by so much as an inch. 175 men would later say they heard about that parking barrier and came anyway, came without being asked twice, came from across 3 counties in under 4 hours. But that was later. That was the part nobody expected. What happened first was a question, asked quietly, by a man who most people crossed the street to avoid, and the reason the boy answered it at all was the part nobody in that lot was ready for. The sky that Thursday morning was the color of old pewter, flat and close, the kind of October sky that presses down on the grassland east of the Black Hills like a palm on a table. Cold front moving through from the north. Garrett Olson had felt it in his left shoulder before he opened his eyes, which was how he measured most mornings now, in degrees of ache. He was 54 years old. He had ridden for the Northgate Riders since he was 29, and the club had watched him age the way a mountain watches erosion, without comment and without surprise. He was the oldest man riding out of their chapter. He had held road captain, sergeant-at-arms, and treasurer across different spans of years, and he held nothing now except the respect that accumulates in a man when he stops needing to claim it. He was 6'1" and had not been lean since his early 40s. His beard was the color of iron ore streaked with chalk, kept long and close trimmed on the sides, and his hands were the hands of a man who had rebuilt engines in the cold for 3 decades, wide across the knuckle, the skin thickened at the base of each finger from grip. His face was not the kind of face that made strangers feel at ease. He knew this. He had stopped being bothered by it roughly 15 years ago, around the time he understood that ease was not always the thing a situation required. He had been riding a loop that morning with no destination, which was the only kind of riding he trusted when the grief came back in autumn. October always brought it back. October was when his daughter had been 8 years old. October was when she stopped being 8 years old. He did not let himself go further than that thought on a public road. He pulled up to the Dollar General because he needed coffee and a paper cup to hold it in, and he saw the boy on the barrier, and he did not keep going. The lot had 4 other people in it, a woman loading bags into the back of an SUV with Montana plates, 2 men in a county water truck eating breakfast sandwiches with the windows down, a store employee in an orange vest arranging a cart corral near the entrance. None of them were looking at the boy with anything more than the sideways attention you give a thing that worries you but does not require you to act. Garrett watched the employee glance at the boy and then look away. He watched one of the men in the water truck say something to the other and nod toward the parking barrier and then take another bite of his sandwich. He watched the woman with the Montana plates load her last bag and get in her car and sit for a moment before she started the engine, as if she were deciding something, and then she started it. Garrett put his kickstand down. He unclipped his helmet. He walked across the lot toward the boy, and he heard the employee's posture change before he saw it, heard the small sound of boots shifting on blacktop, the sound of someone preparing to intervene between a large, frightening man and a child. Garrett did not blame him for that. He walked to within 4 feet of the boy and crouched down so that his eyes were level with the boy's eyes, and he said, "You waiting for someone, or you waiting for something?" The boy looked at him without flinching. That was the first thing Garrett noticed. The boy did not flinch. "I'm waiting for my brother," the boy said. "He's inside." Garrett looked at the store. The automatic doors were propped open by a yellow wet floor sign. He could see 2 cash registers and a refrigerated case, and nobody moving between them. "How long has he been inside?" Garrett said. The boy thought about this with the seriousness of someone performing an important calculation. "Longer than he said," the boy said. Garrett settled his weight back onto his heels. He looked at the plastic bag knotted around the boy's wrist. Inside it, visible through the thin white plastic, was a single can of something, the label obscured by the twist of the bag. "What's in the bag?" Garrett said. "His medicine," the boy said. And then, with the particular bluntness of a child who has learned to report facts without dramatizing them, because dramatizing them has never helped, he said, "He hasn't eaten since Tuesday." Garrett stood up. He put his hand flat against his sternum for a moment, not a gesture for the boy's benefit, just a private adjustment. Then he walked toward the doors. The boy's name was Cord. He told Garrett this without being asked, in the same tone you give someone your order number, necessary information, delivered efficiently. His full name was Cordell James Prater, and he was 8 years old, and he lived with his brother Nate in the house on Mineral Creek Road, where their grandmother had lived until April. He said April the way he said Tuesday, with a factual flatness that was more terrible than tears would have been. Garrett sat with him on the parking barrier while they waited for the ambulance, because by the time he had found Nate in the back corner of the store, wedged between the automotive supplies and the seasonal display of plastic rakes, it was clear that waiting was over, as a general condition of Nate's life. Nate Prater was 17 years old, and he had been sick in a way that had no name yet, which was the most frightening kind of sick there was, the kind that the body announces through collapse rather than complaint. He was on the floor. His breathing was present. That was what Garrett had to work with, and he worked with it. He called for the store employee, who called 911, who dispatched from Rapid City, 14 minutes out. Garrett went back and sat with Cord. The plastic bag was still on the boy's wrist. The woman with the Montana plates was gone. The sky pressed down. Cord said, "Is he going to be okay?" Garrett said, "People are coming." He said it quietly, the way you say a thing when it is the truest available thing and you know it is not enough. He did not know yet how many people were coming. He did not know yet that 175 was the number the morning was building toward. The ambulance came in 13 minutes, not 14. Garrett stood back from the paramedics and watched them work, and while he watched, he made the first call. He did not make it to a club officer. He made it to Del Riggs, who was the Northgate Riders' informal chaplain in the way that some men become chaplains, not by appointment but by accumulation. By being the one who always answers, by being the one whose voice does not change when things are bad. Del was 51, a former welder, with a silver braid down his back and a way of listening that made people say more than they meant to. Garrett said, "I've got a situation on Sturgis Road, Dollar General. Boy named Cord, 8 years old, brother's going to the hospital, and from what the kid's telling me, they've been alone in that house since April." Del said, "Grandmother." Garrett said, "Gone." Del was quiet for 3 seconds, not a long silence, but a working one. Then he said, "Who else are you calling?" Garrett said, "You first." Del said, "Give me 20 minutes." He did not ask what was needed. He did not ask what the plan was. He had known Garrett Olson for 19 years, and he understood that Garrett did not make a first call unless the situation was beyond what one man could carry. Del made 4 calls in the next 7 minutes, and each of those 4 men made 3 calls, and the geometry of it was not complicated, but the speed of it was remarkable. The way a brush fire is not complicated, but the speed of it is. The way it travels faster than you believe a thing can travel until you are watching it go. Cord would not get in the ambulance. This was the thing that stopped the paramedics. They were professional and experienced, and they explained the situation clearly and calmly, and Cord listened to all of it with his hands folded in his lap and the plastic bag still on his wrist, and then he said, "I'll wait here." The lead paramedic, a woman named Sasha who had been doing this work for 11 years, knelt down and said, "Your brother needs you to come, so you can be there when he wakes up." Cord said, "He'll know I stayed." The paramedic looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the bag on the boy's wrist. He understood, suddenly, with the kind of understanding that arrives whole rather than in parts, what the boy was doing. He was holding the medicine. He had been assigned the medicine, or had assigned himself the medicine, and his post was this parking barrier. And he was not leaving his post, because leaving your post was how things got lost, and things had already been lost. And he was 8 years old, and he had decided that the thing he could control was staying. Garrett crouched down in front of him again. He said, "Cord, if you give me that bag, I will carry it to your brother myself. I will put it in his hand." Cord looked at him for a long time. The wind off the grassland came through the lot and lifted a candy wrapper off the blacktop and took it toward the road. Cord said, "You'll be there when he wakes up." It was not entirely a question. Garrett said, "I'll be there." Cord looked at the bag on his wrist. Then he unknotted it, slowly and carefully, the way you undo a thing you tied well, and he held it out. They rode to the hospital together in the ambulance, Cord and Garrett, which was not a standard arrangement and required a conversation between the paramedic named Sasha and her dispatcher, and then a brief pause in which all parties arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the alternatives were worse. Cord sat on the bench seat with both hands in his lap. He watched the equipment. He said, "What does that one do?" 3 times, about 3 different pieces of equipment. And Sasha told him each time with the same patient accuracy. And Garrett watched the boy store each answer, filing it away with the seriousness of someone who believes information will eventually be useful. The hospital was Rapid City Regional. Garrett knew the parking structure, the main entrance, the ER bay, the family waiting area on the 2nd floor, all of it from different reasons across different years. He knew the chaplain's room off the east corridor. He did not think about that now. He carried the plastic bag. Cord walked beside him and did not reach for it. Nate Prater was 15 years old, not 17. The paramedics had been working from Cord's estimate, which had the logic of a younger sibling's math, the kind that rounds up in the direction of safety. Nate was 15, which the intake nurse established from the school ID in his jacket pocket, and 15 changed things the way a single digit can change a whole equation. The intake forms asked for a guardian and got a silence, and the silence asked for a social services consultation, and the social services consultation asked for a case number, and the case number asked for a file that turned out to already exist, which was the most heartbreaking kind of file, the one that proves a situation was already known and already waiting. Garrett sat in the waiting area with Cord, and they did not speak much. Cord had found a loose thread on the hem of his sweatshirt and was winding it around his finger and releasing it, over and over. Garrett had his phone in his hand. Dell had sent 3 words, 18 minutes out. That was 6 minutes ago. Garrett looked at the boy. He looked at the doors. He did not look at the chaplain's room. The hospital's 2nd floor waiting area had a window that faced northwest, and through it in the distance, past the edge of the city's roofline, the grassland opened up the way it always did, flat and enormous and gray-brown in October, stretching toward a horizon that seemed slightly too far away to be real. Garrett had grown up 30 miles east of here. He had watched that grassland in every weather and every season, and it still had the power to make him feel small, in a way that was not unpleasant, in a way that reminded him the problem was always smaller than the land. He was thinking about this, or trying to, when he heard them, not saw them, heard them first. The low, rolling percussion of engines coming off the interstate, the specific chord of it that you knew if you knew it, that you could not mistake for anything else. the way a choir sounds different from a crowd even before you hear the words. He looked at the window. He could not see the parking structure from this angle. Cord had heard it too. He had stopped winding the thread. He was looking at Garrett. "What is that?" Cord said. Garrett said, "Those are my people." Cord looked at the window and then at Garrett. "How many?" he said. Garrett looked at his phone. Dell had sent another message. It was a number. Just a number. No words around it. Garrett read it twice. He looked at Cord. "A lot," he said. 175 men. The parking structure of Rapid City Regional Hospital had never processed that number of motorcycles in a single hour, and the parking attendant on duty, a retired postal worker named Carl who had worked that booth for 11 years, would later say that he stopped counting at 90 and simply opened the arm and left it up. They came in groups of 8 and 12 and 15, off every road that approached from the east and south. The Northgate riders and the men who rode with them when the situation was the kind that required riding. They wore leather and denim and the particular expression of men who have decided something and are now doing it. They filled the structure and overflowed into the surface lot and lined the service road 2 deep. Carl stood outside his booth and watched and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Inside the hospital, at the admissions desk, a security officer named Branch, who was 26 years old and had been on the job for 14 months, watched the lobby fill with people who were not the sort of people the lobby usually held, and reached for his radio and then did not use it, because none of them were doing anything. They were signing in, all of them, each man, one by one, signing the visitor log in the clear block letters you use when you want to be legible, when you want the record to say that you were here and you were accountable. Branch watched this for 4 minutes, and then he put his radio back on his belt. He had been wrong about what the situation was going to be, and he knew it, and he filed the knowledge away. Del Riggs came up to the second floor first, ahead of the others, because Garrett had asked him to, and because Dell moved through hospitals the way a man moves through a place he has had to learn. He was carrying a paper bag from a diner 2 blocks east called the Roundhouse, which had been open for 31 years by a woman named Vera Hapscom, who had put together 4 hot meals in 40 minutes, when Dell had called and said the words, 8-year-old boy, and alone, since April, without any additional context, because those words were their own context. Dell sat down across from Cord and put the bag on the seat between them and said, "You like eggs?" Cord looked at the bag. "Yes," he said. Dell said, "Good." Vera put in extra. Cord opened the bag with the care of someone who has learned not to assume that good things stay. He looked inside for a long time before he took anything out. Garrett watched him. He had to look at the window for a moment. The grassland was out there, gray and enormous, and the engines had gone quiet below, and the quiet was its own kind of sound, the sound of 175 men waiting in an orderly and patient way, which is louder than noise when you know what it means. By 2 in the afternoon, the hospital's family services coordinator, a methodical woman named Patricia Stowe, who had spent 19 years navigating the machinery of child welfare, had 4 open lines on her desk and a legal pad dense with notes, and a look on her face that she would describe later, to her husband, as the look of someone watching a glacier move. The Prater case file had arrived from the state system by 11:30. It was not a thin file. It documented the grandmother's decline from the previous January, a placement assessment that had been scheduled for September and rescheduled twice, and a home visit that had been completed in August, but had not yet generated a formal recommendation. Patricia read it twice and made a sound that was not a word, and then she went downstairs. She walked through the lobby, which still had 40 or 50 men in it, some of them sitting on every available surface, some of them standing along the walls with their arms crossed and their expressions neutral, the way men stand when they are prepared to wait for a very long time. She stopped in front of a man with a silver braid and a paper cup of coffee. "Are you with these people?" she said. Dell said, "I'm with the boy." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Then we should talk." Dell said, "Lead the way." She did. What Patricia Stowe told Dell Riggs, and what Dell told Garrett an hour later in the corridor outside Nate's room, was that the placement assessment had found no living relatives capable of assuming guardianship within the state, that Nate and Cord Prater had been functionally self-managing since their grandmother's death in April, a span of 26 weeks during which no formal intervention had been made, and that the current situation triggered a mandatory placement protocol with a 72-hour window before the boys would be transferred to county emergency foster care. Garrett listened to this with his back against the corridor wall and his arms folded and his eyes on the floor. 72 hours. He said it back to Dell not as a question but as a measurement, testing its dimensions. Dell said, "Patricia says there may be options inside that window, but they require documentation and a demonstrable support network." Garrett looked up. He said, "How many men do we have downstairs?" Dell said, "Counted 160 when I came up, more arriving." Garrett said, "That's a support network." Dell said, "She's going to need more than a head count." Garrett said, "Then we give her more than a head count." He pushed off the wall and went to find Patricia Stowe. He found her in the family consultation room off the east corridor, the one he knew from a different reason, a room he had not entered since the October 11 years ago, when a doctor had told him something that ended the life he had been living and began the one he was in now. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The room had beige walls and 2 chairs, and a window that faced the same northwest direction as the waiting area, the same grassland, the same flat gray sky. Patricia Stowe was at the small table with her legal pad. She looked up at him with the professional neutrality of someone who has learned to judge situations by documentation rather than by appearance. He did not blame her for that either. He walked in and sat down. He said, "My name is Garrett Olson. Tell me what the boys need." She said, "Mr. Olson, I appreciate the support that's been shown today. But what these children need is a stable registered placement, not a demonstration." He said, "Then let's talk about registration." She said, "Guardianship applications require a background check, proof of stable housing, financial documentation, and a home evaluation." He said, "I have a house. It's been mine for 22 years. Background check is clean. Financial documentation I can produce by tomorrow morning." She looked at him over her legal pad. She said, "You're talking about applying for emergency guardianship." He said, "Is there a faster word for it?" She was quiet for a moment. She wrote something. She said, "The home evaluation is not waivable." He said, "When can someone come?" She said, "The soonest I can schedule is Monday." He said, "Today is Thursday." She said, "I know." The room held that. Garrett drove back to his house on Mineral Creek Road, which was 3.7 miles from the Prater property. He had not been down that road since summer, and he took it slowly, reading it the way you read a road you know well after an absence, watching what had changed and what had not. The Prater house was visible from the road for about 40 yards before a stand of cottonwoods blocked the view. He stopped and looked at it through the trees. It was a small house, pale yellow, with a front porch that had lost a section of railing. The grass was long and the windows were dark. A plastic lawn chair on the porch had blown sideways and been left sideways. It was not a house in which it was easy to believe that 2 boys had spent 26 weeks alone. And then it was, because once you saw it clearly, it was impossible to see it any other way. He drove on to his own property. He sat on his front steps for a while. The cold front had sharpened by late afternoon, and the wind was coming steady out of the northwest, and the light was going amber and flat across the grass. He thought about his daughter. He was allowed to do that here, on these steps, in this light. He thought about her hands, which had been the exact size that Cord's hands were now. He thought about the last October she was 8, and the way she had carried her backpack on both shoulders, even though the other kids at school wore it on one, because she said it was better for your back. which she had read somewhere and had told him about with the authority of a person who has done the research. He let himself think about that for a little while, and then he went inside and started pulling documents out of the filing cabinet. Dell arrived at 7:30 with 6 other men. Marcus Forey, who ran a welding shop and had done pro bono work for the County Emergency Services Department for 6 years, and new people. Roy Skeeter Baines, who had a contractor's license and had been inside more South Dakota homes than anyone in the county. A man called Longshot, who handled the club's bookkeeping and who nobody called by his given name, and who could produce a clean financial summary from raw documents in under 3 hours. 2 men named Ellis Crane and Pete Dunbar, who were there because they were always there when something needed doing, and they did not require a specific assignment. And a woman named Connie Forey, Marcus's sister, who was a licensed social worker in Pennington County and who had driven 2 hours from Pierre when Marcus had called her at noon. Connie was 43 years old and direct in the way that people are direct when they have spent a career translating between the language of systems and the language of people who need things from those systems. She sat down at Garrett's kitchen table and looked at the documents he had spread across it and said, "You're missing the last 2 years of utility statements and anything that shows the house meets habitation standards." Skeeter said, "I can put together the habitability report tonight. I know the form." She looked at him. "You'd be doing that as a licensed contractor, not as a club member," he said. "I've got both licenses in my wallet." She said, "The evaluation Monday is still the threshold." Garrett said, "What happens between now and Monday?" She said, "The boys stay in hospital custody, which is not the same as county custody yet. It gives us the window." Dell said, "Then we use the window." They worked until past midnight. The petition for emergency kinship guardianship, because that was the correct legal designation, kinship extending in South Dakota statute to any person who has an established relationship with the child and can demonstrate the capacity and willingness to provide a stable home, was filed electronically at 11:47 on Thursday night by Connie Forey on Garrett's behalf, with supporting attachments that included 22 years of property records, 3 years of tax returns, a habitability certification signed by Roy Skeeter Baines in his professional capacity, 6 character letters drafted that evening by 6 different people and signed by 24 more, and a photograph that Dell had taken on his phone in the hospital waiting area at 4 o'clock that afternoon, which showed 143 men in the frame and an indeterminate additional number outside it, all of them waiting. The photograph was not legally required. Connie included it anyway, attached as a supplemental document titled Community Support Documentation, because she had learned that the machinery of child welfare occasionally needed to be shown the size of a thing before it could respond proportionally. She sent the filing to Patricia Stowe's work address and her direct intake line with a read receipt request on both. The read receipt on the intake line came back at 12:19 in the morning. Connie looked at her phone and said, "She's still there." Nobody said anything because that was the kind of information that required a moment. Friday moved like frozen ground, slow and resistant and cold. Patricia Stowe requested 2 additional documents by 9 in the morning, both of which Longshot had already prepared, and they were returned within 40 minutes. A hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9, which was the fastest the family court docket could accommodate, and Connie drove back to Pierre to appear in person as the social work professional of record. Garrett spent Friday at the hospital. He brought Cord a book about aircraft because Cord had asked about the ambulance equipment with the thoroughness of someone building a knowledge base, and Garrett had reasoned sideways to aviation and turned out to be right. Cord read 40 pages of it in the time Garrett sat with him and stopped to read 2 passages aloud without being asked, which was how Garrett knew the boy trusted him. Nate was awake by Friday afternoon. He was running on fluids and monitored rest and a diagnosis of severe anemia and secondary infection. conditions that had been building for months, conditions that were treatable, conditions that a person his age should not have been managing alone for 26 weeks. The doctor, a quiet man named Harold, told Garrett this in the corridor with the careful language of someone who knows they are speaking to a person who is not technically family, but who is the closest available thing. Garrett said, "Is he going to be all right?" Dr. Harold said, "He's going to be all right." Garrett put his hand flat on the wall beside him for a moment, and then he took it away. Nate Prater had dark eyes and a quality of stillness that read as age, the kind of stillness that people develop when they have been responsible for something they were not old enough to be responsible for. He looked at Garrett from his hospital bed with the careful assessment of someone who has learned to take the measure of adults quickly and revise it upward or downward based on very specific evidence. He said, "You're the one who was with Cord." Garrett said, "I am." Nate said, "He told me you carried the medicine." Garrett said, "I carried it. He got it there." Nate was quiet. He looked at the window. He said, "We don't need someone to take over. We just need some help with a few things." Garrett understood that this was not a simple statement. It was a position that the boy had been holding for 26 weeks and probably longer. A flag planted in the ground against the possibility that help would come in a form that required surrender. Garrett said, "I know." He meant it without elaboration, which is the only way to mean some things. He said, "How would you feel about eating something?" Nate said, "What is it?" Garrett said, "Vera at the Roundhouse sent over enough food for about a dozen people." Nate looked at him. "How many people are here?" he said. Garrett said, "For you two? 175, give or take the ones who had to go back to work." Nate looked at the ceiling. He breathed in slowly. He said, "That's a lot of people for one bag of medicine." Garrett said, "It usually works out that way." The hearing on Monday morning lasted 38 minutes. Connie Forey presented the application. Patricia Stowe, who had driven in early and sat at the petitioner's table with a legal pad that was now on its third page of notes for this case, said for the record that the department did not oppose the application, that the emergency kinship petition met the statutory criteria, and that the applicant had demonstrated in an unusually thorough manner both the capacity and the community support to provide stable placement. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Cecilia Voss, who had been on the family court bench for 14 years, read the application and the supporting documents and the photograph in silence. She looked at the photograph for a moment longer than she looked at anything else. She said, "Mr. Olson, the court has reviewed your application and finds it sufficient. Emergency kinship guardianship is granted pending the standard 90-day review." She paused. She said, "I'll note for the record that I've reviewed a great many emergency kinship applications in 14 years. I don't believe I've seen one with this level of demonstrated community investment." Garrett said, "The boys have people." The judge looked at him. She said, "Yes, I can see that." She signed the order. The clerk stamped it. That was all. Nate and Cord Prater came to Garrett's house on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, which was the earliest the discharge paperwork and the placement logistics allowed. Nate walked in with his duffel bag over his shoulder and stood in the entryway and looked at the house with an expression that was the closest thing to relief Garrett had seen on the boy's face. Relief being a difficult expression for someone who has learned to manage without hoping for things. Cord came in behind him carrying the empty plastic grocery bag because he had kept it, folded it flat, and put it in his jacket pocket at the hospital, and he had it still. Garrett had not asked him about it. He knew what it was. It was Cord's proof that he had stayed at his post. It was what he would carry until he didn't need to carry it anymore. The house had a second bedroom that Garrett had spent Saturday and Sunday clearing and painting with help from Dell and Ellis Crane and Skeeter and two others who showed up unbidden with rollers and a tarp, and it was ready in the way that a room is ready when people have worked on it with intention rather than speed. Cord stood in the doorway of it and looked at the walls and then at Garrett and said, "It's yellow." Garrett said, "It is." Cord said, "Like the other house." Garrett had not noticed this. He had chosen the paint can by reaching for the lightest color on the shelf. He said, "I guess it is." Cord went inside and sat on the edge of the bed and looked around and did not say anything else, which was its own kind of answer. The Northgate Riders held a formal chapter meeting 3 weeks later at their regular hall, and the membership voted to establish an annual supply drive named the Prater Ride, which was a name suggested by Dell and accepted without opposition. Running every October between the Rapid City chapter and a series of collection points across the grassland east of the Black Hills, gathering winter clothing and non-perishable food and school supplies for kids in the same situation the Prater boys had been in, which was the situation of being alone, with more responsibility than they had years to carry. In the first year, it collected enough material to stock the County Emergency Placement Program's supplemental closet for 4 months. In the second year, it generated enough for 6. By the fourth year, there were 63 participating households and a coordinated drop-off system that Marcus Forey's wife had built into a spreadsheet that she ran from her phone with the efficiency of a woman who does not understand why more things are not this organized. The number 175 was stitched in white thread onto a patch that every participating rider wore on the left arm of their vest, below the chapter rocker, small enough that you had to know what you were looking for to find it. People always asked what it meant. The answer was always the same. It was the number of men who showed up for 2 boys in a plastic bag. It was the number that had started as Dell's text message, 7 digits and no context, and become the measure of what possible looks like when nobody looks away. Nate graduated from high school 2 years and 8 months after the October morning in the Dollar General parking lot. He walked across the stage at Rapid City Stevens in a gymnasium full of families and received his diploma from a principal who called his name with the same inflection as every other name, which is the exact correct inflection. And in the third row on the left side, Garrett Olson sat in a folding chair that was slightly too small for him and did not take photographs because he had asked Dell to do that, because he did not trust Cord, who was 10 by then and had read everything available in the school library about aviation and was now working laterally into mechanical engineering, sat beside him and watched his brother walk and said nothing, which was Cord's way of saying everything. Garrett looked at the stage. He looked at the boy he had found on a parking barrier, 11 years younger than his daughter had been when she stopped being 8. He thought about the bag on the boy's wrist, the twice-knotted bag, and the way Cord had untied it so carefully, slowly, as if undoing a thing he had tied well. Some things, he had learned, could be carried right up until someone made it possible to set them down. Some things waited to be given, in just exactly that way, to just exactly the right pair of hands. The engines had been loud that October morning, louder than anything else in that flat and enormous landscape. And now, 11 years later, in a gymnasium, on a Tuesday in May, sitting next to a boy who no longer flinched, Garrett understood that the thunder of them had never been threat or menace or force. It had been, all along, the sound of people arriving.